Uh, well, I would like to welcome each of you to Todd Talks, which comes to you every other Wednesday as a program of the Truett Church Network under the direction of Dr. Matt Homeyer. Thank you very much for joining us today. Our guest is Dr. Frank M. Yamada. Dr. Yamada serves as Executive Director of the Association of Theological Schools, a position that he has held since July of 2017. As Executive Director of ATS, Dr. Yamada oversees the work of both the association as well as the Commission on Accrediting. Prior to joining the staff of ATS, Dr. Yamada taught Hebrew Bible Old Testament for 9 years at Seabury Western Theological Seminary. Thereafter, he joined the faculty of McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago as Associate Professor of Hebrew Bible and Director of the Center for Asian American Ministries. Then, in 2011, Dr. Yamada was elected as McCormick's 10th president and as the first Asian American to lead a Presbyterian USA seminary as president. A graduate of Southern California College, Dr. Yamada grew up in Southern California, before spending 7 years on the other coast, the East Coast at Princeton, New Jersey, where he earned a Master of Divinity and a PhD at Princeton Theological Seminary. Dr. Yamada is an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church, USA, and has written and spoken not only about matters pertaining to Hebrew Bible Old Testament, but even more pressing and pointing for this hour on the future of the church and theological education. So Frank, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Todd. It's such a pleasure to be with all of you.
Frank, as we begin, there may be any number of people who are joining us who do not know a great deal about the work of the Association of Theological Schools, of which Baylor's Truett Seminary is an accredited member. So I wonder if you would please offer an overview of the association for our audience. And as you do so, if you might address why you believe that accreditation is so vitally important.
Thanks, Todd. Surely. One of the first things that I think your watchers or your listeners would probably like to know is that, first of all, that we are actually two organizations under one mission. So we, the Association of Theological Schools, which is the membership organization, and we are the Commission on Accrediting, which handles all the accrediting functions for the schools. Our mission is to promote the improvement and enhancement of theological schools to the benefit of communities of faith and the broader public. So I think it's important to note there that even within our own mission statement as a membership organization, that our goal and our ends are not just to serve the theological schools and the industry, so to speak, of higher education, but we serve the greater goods of communities of faith and the broader public, particularly to the formation of religious leaders. With regard to accreditation and the value of accreditation for schools, I think you can look at it from the perspective of students and from the perspective of schools. So for students, and I think this is the case with Truett, for those schools that participate in the federal loan program, it is required for such schools to be an accredited institution with an approved accrediting agency to be able to benefit from those funds and to participate in those loan programs. So from the student's perspective, it provides access to the government funding. It also for students is a seal of approval that the degrees that you get from the schools that you apply to that are ATS accredited schools have agreed to and hold each other accountable to a set of standards and agreed upon standards for accreditation. From the school's point of view, it is both a useful tool, and that same seal of approval acts as a way to recruit future donors, prospective donors. I think donors love to know that the school that that they're thinking about serving, for example, on their board or as a donor to, They love to know that this school is providing quality theological education, and to have a set of standards that shows and demonstrates that is just a benefit for them. It also helps with the recruiting of students, that students want to know that the education they're receiving is quality theological education. And it also assists and helps with recruitment of faculty, because faculty want to know that the place that they're going to teach is about doing quality theological education. So there's benefits both to the students and the schools to be an accredited organization within the Association of Theological Schools.
That's very helpful. Frank, as I noted in my introduction of you, you've served as the executive director of ATS now since 2017. As you assumed this role, you followed Dr. Daniel O. Elshire, who served in the same capacity for 26 years, and if I recall correctly, served at ATS 26 years overall. So 20 years as executive director, 26 years for the association. So here's my question. As you followed a person of Dan's stature and standing, I think this is particularly helpful for those of us who have received this mantle. What are some leadership lessons that you have learned and that you think might be helpful to others who seek to lead, even as you're now leading?
That's a great question, Todd, and thanks for asking it. If I'm not mistaken, you also followed an executive dean who had served for quite some time and had a long tenure. So you probably also have some leadership lessons with which you could share. But I think it has provided me with a number of leadership lessons. A few here just to kind of name. First of all, for those of you who don't know Dan Elshire, I think he actually taught at Baylor for a little while.
That's right.
In his retirement. I mean, this is
following his retirement from ATS. Dan came to be a visiting professor at Truett for a semester.
So some of you may have had the opportunity and the privilege to be able to sit in a class with him. Dan is the premier kind of voice and legacy holder and historian about theological education. You don't replace Dan Elshire. I mean, that is actually one of the leadership lessons that you need to walk in with. You will not be able to replace the person who preceded you. And in fact, another way to frame that is that person will leave a very strong legacy and imprint on the organization. And your job as a leader, as an executive, is not to come in and try and undo that. So actually, one of the first things in one of my first practices when I came to ATS was I sat down and I interviewed every staff person. I listened to what it is that they do, what it is that they care about, what it is, how they understand their work. And part of that work as a leader is to do that transitional work of helping the organization think of this transition and move into that transition in leadership. And the best way that you can do that is by not coming in a real cavalier way saying, here's the agenda, here's who's staying, here's who's going. Really is to come in and listen and build a base for your leadership by listening. The second is you really need to distinguish your role as a leader and that you are not that person who preceded you. And you are at the same time not the opposite of that person who preceded you. So one of the ways that I sought to do this was one of the ways that we articulate our vision right now is that it is both innovation and legacy. It is both legacy and innovation. So how could we build off of this great legacy that Dan built within the ATS? And how can we also help schools to innovate in these times of significant change that all theological schools are going through? So it really is a way to help bridge the past with a future and vision for the future. And the last thing I would say is and this may be more particular to our case at ATS, but one of the things and one of the strengths that I bring with regard to leadership is really in team building and in empowering the leadership of others. When you come into a new place, you don't come into a vacuum. You come into a place that has leaders that are already present, have been doing their work for many years before you even came. So one of the moves that I thought was really instrumental in us moving forward was to think, I was really trying to develop a notion of collective wisdom, where for many good reasons, one could argue because of a person of Dan's stature was the executive director for so long, a lot of the wisdom tended to reside in that corner office. And that's when I was a board member at ATS, everybody wanted to sit at his feet and listen to him talk because he was just a brilliant teacher and person to think about theological education. But what we began to do as a staff is to say, let's talk about what leadership we all bring, and how do we collect that wisdom in the room, because our collective wisdom may be indeed greater than any one person's wisdom. So those are just three things that I can think of off the top of my head that I think were real leadership lessons for me. And by the way, this is the second time I've succeeded an executive. My first time as a president of McCormick, and then here at ATS, where I succeeded an executive who had been in their role for over a decade, and close to 2. So,
wow, Frank, those are very helpful. I mean, and the exciting thing is they're portable. So some who are listening today are engaged in practical ministry and on a congregational level, and to take these lessons and apply them where they are and where they go is really valuable. So Frank, in June of 2020, the ATS Commission membership overwhelmingly adopted new standards of accreditation. If I recall correctly, there was a single negative vote, and we gather that this person could have gotten confused, but be that as it may, it's as close to unanimous, kind of like that church vote, right? This marked the successful culmination of a 2-year process of conversation and consultation with member schools. So first of all, congratulations that you were able, along with your colleagues, to guide this process to such a successful end is no small feat. And those of us who are member schools, thank you. So with broad brushstrokes, Frank, would you share with those who join us today what these standards are, and maybe what's new about them? And as you reflect upon this entire process, what has most encouraged you? And what are some suggestions that you might offer to other organizations that are in need of, or are even in the midst of, this kind of systemic change?
man, great questions, Todd. You should brand this Todd Talks. I think they could be, you could really explore them and then expand them further. With regard to the standards themselves, a couple of thoughts. One, about the standards themselves, and about the context in which this vote was taken, because I think both are significant.
Yes.
With regard to the standards themselves, as you named, this was really the culmination of a 2-year process where we did a lot of listening. It was basically 1 year of listening to what the members felt like they needed a new set of standards. The second was a year of rewriting, reflecting, and more listening, getting feedback and input. It was an extensive process where we engaged the majority of the membership, thousands of comments, dozens and dozens of focus groups and subcommittees, and it was an incredible process. And just one little quick word about that regarding process, and because this is kind of the theme, is what can we learn about leadership in this? And that is that when you just have an incredible team of folks, kind of really setting them loose to lead is important. This process would not have taken place in the way that it had taken place without the redevelopment task force, which was a member appointed task force, or was an appointed task force of mostly members, staff, ATS staff as well, who really governed and led this process. The chair was Sarah Drummond, who is the founding dean of Andover Newton Theological School at Yale Divinity School, Andover Seminary at Yale Divinity School, and then also of Oliver McMahon, who's at Pentecostal Theological Seminary. So it was really a collaborative effort among the membership and the staff. And then two staff people in particular, Tom Tanner and Debbie Creamer, who were really instrumental in helping think through as well the process. But again, without their leadership, this process would not have, and without the leadership of this task force, this process would not have taken place. So really it is about getting the right people doing the right things. And a lot of credit has to, it really was a lesson in teamwork and in teamwork leadership. On the standards themselves, the standards really, there were three themes that went throughout both that process, that 2-year process, but then are evidenced in the standards themselves. And those three themes were the theme of the biennial meeting. And those themes were quality, flexibility, or flexibility of and clarity. I think it was actually, the order was quality, clarity, and flexibility. But let me just say a brief sentence about each of those. In terms of quality, really what defines these standards, the old standards were really based on specific practices that were going on in schools. And they were standards that said, you know, this is how you do, for example, an online class. Here's the standards around online teaching. Here's all the standards on every single degree program. There were so many different standards based on the practices of schools. These new standards really are looking at all of these different practices, but through the lens of principles of quality. So principles that can be applied across many different kinds of schools, among the many different ecclesial families and different contexts in which theological education happens. And so by that virtue, they really kind of point to a true north principle that helps to understand what educational quality can look like. And then the school then can figure out ways to implement that principle in different formats and different modalities, these kinds of things, or within their given context. With regard to simplicity or clarity, we went from the standards that were about 100 pages to standards that are now 21 pages, 18 if you don't take into account the preamble, right? So, so they are literally more simple. Not simplistic. They're actually very elegantly simple, but they're certainly more simple. And lastly, flexibility. These times for theological education, I think it can be a burden upon schools if the standards would have been just a series of compliance checklists that you have to meet. Instead, these standards, again, as principles, really allow for schools to embody these principles and these standards in really flexible ways that make sense of the school in terms of their own mission, in terms of their own contexts, in terms of the type of school that they are. I think that flexibility, especially given this current environment of COVID, is just extraordinary and super helpful to schools for this time and this place.
Frank, that's a suitable segue. In fact, a perfect one to my next question. I want us to pivot and to talk about the present state and future prospects of theological education. So what do you see from your seat, from your seat, as some of the opportunities, challenges, trends for graduate schools of theology, not least in this COVID-19 context, the context of a pandemic in which we find ourselves?
So what I would say about the whole pandemic is what we've seen with schools, it's really descriptive of our times, is it really kind of happened in phases. So what we saw in the spring of 2020, when the pandemic was really beginning to escalate, is that schools were trying to respond to the immediate and most urgent needs. So many schools, I'm sure Truett included, they went to emergency remote delivery of their classes. There was a lot of work that schools had to do to ensure the safety and health of their students and their faculty and staff. So many schools, in fact, most went to remote formats, not just in terms of teaching, but their work. Yes. There were all these other immediate responses. And actually ATS, as a member organization, we provided resources for things like, we held webinars, just-in-time webinars for things like, how do you do a remote commencement? I mean, this was something that no one had imagined they would have had to do when the academic year began in the fall of 2019. But things like remote commencements, things like how do you do remote recruitment? All of these, how do you train a faculty that may have been trained to think primarily as a classroom-oriented teaching or pedagogy to a pedagogy that has to use online technologies and use more of the learning management system that you're using? All of these things were the immediate things that schools sought to pivot, and we were gathering a whole bunch of data. We did a number of surveys to find out what schools were doing, and these are what schools were doing. They were responding to the immediate. Then there was a stage at which schools really began to shift to the intermediate, like the more the annual term, like what does the fall look like? What does the next academic year look like? And there was a little more intentional planning that went into that. But there were some bigger concerns that were raised. Think questions that some deans and executives had about, what are the fall enrollments going to look like? Are we going to see a drop off because so many people were unemployed, or because financial situations for many had changed? I can say that what we've seen in the near term, and we're still gathering the data. In fact, the data should be coming in, and we should have it probably pretty close to the end of October here, and we'll be able to share those results. But what we're hearing anecdotally is that schools haven't faced the kinds of declines that they were expecting. In fact, some schools have seen record enrollments. That may be a function of something that we saw similar to 2008, which was when folks either got laid off, or when that financial crisis hit, they saw it as an opportunity to think and rethink their vocation. Many of these folks were, of course, already bachelor's holders, or had received their bachelor's, so they were thinking about graduate level theological education. I think that is maybe a short-term result. Again, the data will bear it out, but that seems to be one of what we're hearing firsthand. And on the financial front, a lot of schools did take advantage of some of the governmental programs that were intended to create financial relief for nonprofit organizations, including schools. But it doesn't, and that's the last phase, is we've increasingly seen schools move and begin to think about the long-term impacts of COVID. Are there going to be some financial disruptions? Is this going to have a long-term effect on donors who give to schools? What is the outcome of this that we're seeing in, for example, already in undergraduate institutions where we're seeing some declines in enrollment? And I think that's mostly based on generational demographics more than something related to COVID. These are the ongoing questions. And another way that I framed it for folks is, look, if schools had financial and enrollment challenges prior to the pandemic, it's not like the pandemic is going to either be a magical cure or a horrific disease for the school that's going to send them under. Yeah. But it's not going to, those schools will continue to have those same issues if they had them before the pandemic. They're also going to have them after the pandemic. And in fact, what the pandemic has probably done is placed a magnifying glass on the realities that schools are facing.
Frank, that's just a remarkably helpful response, in the midst of which you noted that some people are beginning to contemplate what this call to theological education might look like. So here's my question.
Mhm.
What guidance would you offer, Frank, to a person who is seeking to discern whether theological education is a next step for them? And to add to that, if a person is pondering perhaps a career in theological education, what wisdom would you offer? What guidance might you give?
Um, so on the first question, in terms of those who might be thinking about being a student in a theological school at such a time as this, to use the phrase from Esther, um, uh, I think when when a country like ours, and by the way, something that you should all know about ATS is that we're a binational organization. We also accredit and serve Canadian schools along with US schools. When crises hit, it is often a time for reflection and vocation and purposeful work that one can do to contribute to the betterment of society, to contribute to the betterment of the church and of communities of faith. Um, I just think that one of the things that I would stress and use as a way for folks to think and to encourage them to think about, we tend to think that when you say theological school or seminary, folks tend to think of it, it sounds like a bunch of courses that you have to take. You'll have to do a lot of writing, and you do. You'll have to write papers and get grades, but really that is only part of the outcome of a theological school. One of the themes, by the way, in the new standards that's really prominent is something that we heard from theological schools, and that is on the issue of formation. This is something that schools do really well. It's something that theological schools do, and that is they do a lot of the work of forming individuals, not just to be potential ministers. That's a track of still a majority of ATS students, but it's also to how to deepen their own faith, how to be a better and more informed Christian or religious person within their own tradition, within their own vocation. We hear stories all the time of people, even senators of the US Congress, who found it so valuable to have a Master of Divinity degree because it helps shape and form their moral sensibilities. So that would be my encouragement. If you can take advantage of the resources that are within theological education, they can be valuable to you no matter what your trajectory of life as a person of faith. And for those who are considering and pondering ministry, you will have such a deep sense of discernment as you go through this process, because you're around other people who are discerning in the same kinds of ways, engaging curriculum, faculty, and other folks who have this formation aspect at the heart of what they do, so that you can begin to think about how you can make a better difference in this world. Now, with regard real quickly to your second question, in terms of those who might be seeking a vocation within theological education, so it's teaching or administration, I think that there is no more exciting place to do work right now. I think our theological institutions are on the vanguard of how innovation is happening, not just in higher education, but in the church. We are deeply engaged with how the church is changing, and we are trying to change along with them. I can think that it is just one of the more exciting times to be employed, to be thinking about and working within a theological school, because if your desire was to go in and be a scholar who locks him or herself away into a study and just writes books and then takes time off to lecture to students, to give them their little pieces of bread, that is not the vocation of the current seminary educator. We are in such a process of creativity and innovation where things are changing before our very eyes in ways that they haven't changed for decades, if not generations. So it is a very, very exciting time to be employed or to have the vocation of theological education as your primary vocation.
And Frank, I may just say that member schools are blessed to have your leadership and your enthusiasm for the task in which we're engaged. We're really grateful. So, Frank, you've been so generous with your time. I know that you've been meeting with commissioners already today, and I won't hold you much longer. But as a final question, I thought that it might be enjoyable for you and valuable for us to listen to a Hebrew Bible Old Testament student and scholar share about particular text or narratives that have encouraged and enriched you in your own work. You alluded to Esther, but also in the midst of this pandemic. What are some wells, some textual wells to which you've turned for nourishment and enrichment?
Well, I hope that I've never really left the world of biblical scholarship because, right. By the way, that's just a little sidebar oddity. I have run into so many administrators and executives in theological schools who were formerly Bible scholars. I don't know what that connection could possibly be, because I don't know how, for example, the book of Genesis helps to inform an executive leader, that there aren't many one-to-one parallels. And I certainly wasn't trained to think that way as a doctoral candidate when I was one. But just a reflection on some things in terms of the Bible and some texts and thoughts about this current situation and the pandemic. First of all, kind of from the broad perspective of why the Bible was written and when it was written and by whom. If you look at when most of the books of the Bible were written, and in fact, when the Bible began to come together as kind of a collection of texts, of authoritative texts, most of those contexts were in the middle of crisis. So as a Hebrew Bible scholar, what most folks know is, while the texts and traditions come, thousands of years in advance of when they were actually collected, in some cases, they were really pulled together kind of in the heart of the Babylonian exile. So at a time when the people of God are experiencing this incredible dislocation in terms of place and space, and therefore a real crux of a crisis of identity, the texts are brought together and brought into a collection, eventually begin to take shape of what we know as the Bible, at a time when the people of God needed to find themselves within their history and within the texts that had formed them, and the traditions that had formed them. So the Bible itself was shaped and pulled together in a time of crisis. And that's what we are experiencing right now. This is a national crisis of which we have not really experienced before. And it is a time in which the Bible becomes instructive, both in terms of the process that brought it together, but in terms of how it can shape and inform a sense of identity of people. Just real quickly, one specific text that has been kind of a little bit of a calling text to me as recent in my time as executive director, and it really comes from the book of Isaiah. In the chapters of the 40s, I think it's actually Isaiah 43, where Isaiah, the Lord declares that I'm about to do a new thing. And this language of doing a new thing. But if you actually read that text very closely, what you see is that then the Lord begins to expound all these new things, but begins evoking this imagery of God's historical and salvific works of the past. The difference is, instead of leading people through the sea, God is now leading people through the desert to return. This is the image of return. There's waters in the desert, again, this evoking these great themes of the wilderness. So one of the lessons that we learn is that indeed, when God says God's doing a new thing, that is always in some ways tied and based in a very old thing that God has always done. That text has really given me a lot of life in this time when things sometimes feel too new.
Yes.
But that God is doing a new thing, and God is continuing to do a new thing among us. And that new thing is always going to be about the transformation of both the people and the place, so that it can be transformed more into God's image. And so that text has really provided a lot of life. And in fact, it is the theme text of the vision and the strategic vision that the board of directors has set for the ATS.
Yes, tying in beautifully to this legacy and innovation of which you spoke earlier.
Exactly.
Frank, frankly, this has been a joy for me. I wish that we could do this over a cup of coffee. I wish that we had been able to do the biennial meeting in Vancouver, but we yearn for and look forward to those times together again. But until, may I just say, not only on behalf of myself and Baylor's Truett Seminary, but other member schools, how grateful we are for your leadership and for the partnership that is ours in theological education. This has been an enriching conversation, and I'm truly grateful for your time, Frank.
Well, we're grateful for what you do at Truett, Todd, and grateful for your leadership as well. So thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, and I hope you have a good afternoon. Talk
you
again
as well.
soon. All right, bye for now.
Blessings.